He covered his nose and said, "You make this house rot," but her grandkids were still holding her hand, begging her to stay. "Welcome back, and enjoy what might be the best story you'll watch today." The morning sun cast harsh shadows through the pristine windows of the Long Island mansion, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny accusations. Dolores Pearson knelt on the cold marble floor of her son's kitchen, her weathered hands gripping a scrub brush that had seen better days. The bleach fumes burned her nostrils, but she continued working, methodically cleaning each tile edge with the dedication of someone who understood that perfection was the price of staying. Her knees, swollen from arthritis and years of honest labor, pressed against the unforgiving stone as she moved inch by inch across the expansive floor. The designer kitchen stretched before her like a monument to wealth, stainless steel appliances that gleamed like mirrors, granite countertops that cost more than she'd earned in a year, and cabinets filled with dishes that were used more for display than dining. Everything was cold, beautiful, and untouchable, much like the man who owned it all. The sound of Italian leather shoes clicking against marble made her freeze. She didn't need to look up to know who approached. The expensive cologne, the measured pace, the way the very air seemed to grow thinner, it could only be Marcos, her eldest son, the boy she'd once rocked to sleep during thunderstorms. Now a stranger in $1,000 suit. He paused beside her, and she could feel his presence like a shadow blocking out the sun. When she finally raised her eyes, she saw him pinching his nose with manicured fingers, his face twisted in disgust as if he'd encountered something rotten. "You make this whole house rot, Ma," he said, his voice as sharp and cold as winter wind. He didn't even look down at her, instead gazing out at his perfectly manicured lawn, as if the very sight of her kneeling there offended his sensibilities. The words hit Dolores like physical blows. Her hands trembled as she gripped the scrub brush tighter, her knuckles white against the yellow plastic handle. She'd given birth to this man, had worked 3 jobs to put him through college, had sacrificed everything so he could have the opportunities she'd never known. Now, he spoke to her like she was something to be discarded, something that had outlived its usefulness. "I'm almost finished," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator. She couldn't bring herself to look at him again, couldn't bear to see the contempt in eyes that had once looked at her with love and admiration. Marcos adjusted his silk tie, a gesture that had become as natural to him as breathing. "Just make sure you are," he replied, already walking away, his attention already elsewhere, on conference calls and stock prices, and the million other things that mattered more to him than the woman who'd given him life. As his footsteps faded into the distance, Dolores sat back on her heels and surveyed her work. The floor gleamed like a mirror, reflecting back her tired face, her gray hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her clothes clean but worn, marking her as someone who didn't belong in this palace of marble and gold. She'd been living here for only 3 months, ever since her landlord in the Bronx had evicted her from the tiny apartment she'd called home for 15 years. The rent had gone up again, as it always did, and her social security check simply couldn't stretch far enough. She hadn't wanted to ask Marcos for help. Pride was one of the few things she had left, and begging felt like losing the last piece of herself that remained intact. But when she'd found herself standing on the sidewalk with 2 garbage bags containing everything she owned, watching a crew throw her furniture into a dumpster, she'd swallowed that pride like bitter medicine and made the call she'd hoped never to make. The memory of that conversation still stung. Marcos had listened with the patience of someone checking items off a to-do list, his responses clipped and efficient. "Fine," he'd said finally. "You can stay temporarily. But there are rules. You pull your weight. You don't interfere with the children's routines. And you stay out of my way." It wasn't love that had opened his door to her, it was obligation, the bare minimum required to maintain his image as a successful family man. But Dolores had found purpose in the small spaces he tried to confine her to. While Marcos worked 16-hour days building his empire, and his wife, Linda, attended charity galas and spa appointments, Dolores had quietly become the heart of the household. She'd taken over the cooking, preparing the kind of meals that actually nourished rather than simply satisfied dietary requirements. She'd learned every detail of her grandchildren's schedules, walking 10-year-old Matthew and 8-year-old Olivia to school each morning, rain or shine, and being there when they returned, ready with snacks and homework help, and the kind of snacks and homework help, and the kind of attention that came from having nowhere else to be, and nothing else that mattered more. Matthew, or Matty as she called him, had his father's dark eyes, but none of his hardness. He was a gentle boy who collected rocks and drew elaborate pictures of dinosaurs, who still sometimes crawled into her lap when he thought no one was looking. Olivia was pure sunlight, all golden curls and infectious laughter, with the imagination that could transform the sterile mansion into a fairy tale kingdom where they were all characters in an endless adventure. It was for them that Dolores endured Marcos's casual cruelty, the way he spoke about her as if she weren't in the room, the way he flinched when she tried to hug him goodbye. She told herself that love was patient, that eventually the boy she'd raised would remember who she was, who they'd been to each other before money had built walls between them. Now, as she struggled to her feet, her joints protesting every movement, she wondered if she'd been lying to herself. Maybe Marcos was right. Maybe she was rotting this perfect house with her presence, bringing the stench of poverty and age into his carefully curated world. Maybe the best thing she could do for everyone was to disappear, to find some corner of the city where old women went to die quietly, and without inconvenience. The sound of children's laughter drifted in from the backyard, and Dolores felt her heart lift despite the weight of her son's words. She moved to the window and watched as Matty and Olivia played on the elaborate swing set that had probably cost more than most people's cars. They were good children, untouched by their father's coldness, still pure in the way that only the very young could be. They ran to her when they were hurt, sought her out when they needed comfort, trusted her with their secrets and their fears. "Grandma!" Olivia's voice rang out as she spotted Dolores at the window. She abandoned her swing and raced toward the house, her face bright with excitement. "Come play with us!" Matty found a butterfly. For a moment, Dolores forgot about aching knees and harsh words, and the crushing weight of feeling unwanted. She smiled and waved, watching as Olivia tugged on her brother's hand, both of them gesturing for her to join them outside. These were the moments that made everything worthwhile, the pure, uncomplicated love of children who hadn't yet learned to measure worth in dollars and appearances. But as she moved toward the door, Linda appeared, perfectly dressed as always, her blonde hair styled in the kind of casual waves that required professional maintenance. She'd been beautiful once, before Botox had frozen her expressions, and years of privilege had hardened her features into a mask of perpetual dissatisfaction. "Dolores," Linda said, her voice carrying the particular tone wealthy women used when addressing service staff. "I need you to handle dinner tonight. Marcos is bringing clients home, and I have a committee meeting that I simply cannot miss." She paused, looking Dolores up and down with barely concealed distaste. "And perhaps you could freshen up. These are important people." The words stung, but Dolores nodded silently. She'd grown accustomed to Linda's casual dismissals, the way she spoke about her as if she were hired help rather than family. In Linda's world, there were only two types of people, those who mattered and those who served those who mattered. Dolores had been firmly categorized in the latter group from the moment she'd walked through their door. "Of course," Dolores replied, smoothing down her worn sweater. "What would you like me to prepare?" Linda waved a manicured hand dismissively. "Something appropriate. Nothing too ethnic. You understand." The implication was clear, nothing that reminded their guests that this family had once been poor, that success hadn't erased their humble origins. As Linda click-clacked away on designer heels, Dolores felt something inside her chest tighten. She'd spent her life being proud of her heritage, of the recipes passed down from her mother and grandmother, of the culture that had shaped her values and her character. Now she was being asked to hide those parts of herself, to become invisible in every way that mattered. The afternoon passed in a blur of preparation. Dolores cooked and cleaned, and set the dining room table with the good china, the pieces that cost more individually than she'd spent on groceries in months. She arranged flowers and polished silver, and tried to make herself as presentable as possible, knowing that no amount of effort would ever make her acceptable to Marcos's world. When the guests arrived, she served dinner silently, moving through the room like a ghost, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates, while conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes swirled around her. She caught fragments of their discussion stock of second homes in the Hamptons, of children attending prestigious boarding schools, of investments and acquisitions, and the casual accumulation of wealth. Marcos held court at the head of the table, charming and confident, every inch the successful businessman. He told jokes and shared market insights, and played the role of gracious host with practiced ease. But Dolores noticed how his eyes never quite met hers when she approached with serving dishes, how he spoke about the help in general terms that somehow managed to include her without acknowledging her as a person with a name and a history, and a heart that was breaking a little more each day. It was nearly midnight when the last guest left, their expensive cars purring away into the darkness. Dolores finished cleaning the dining room and kitchen, her feet aching in shoes that had seen too many years of wear. She was gathering her cleaning supplies when Marcos appeared, loosening his tie with the air of a man who just completed a successful performance. "That went well," he said, more to himself than to her. Then, as if noticing her for the first time all evening, he added, "The salmon was adequate. Try not to oversalt next time." After hours of careful preparation, after choosing every ingredient with thought and care, after cooking with the kind of love that couldn't be bought or taught, her efforts were merely adequate. Dolores felt something fracture inside her chest, a tiny crack that would soon become a chasm. "Yes, Marcos," she said quietly. "I'll remember that." He was already walking away, his mind already on tomorrow's meetings and deals, when he paused at the doorway. Without turning around, he spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of a decision already made. "Mother, I've been thinking, this arrangement isn't working out as well as I'd hoped. Perhaps it's time we discussed alternatives." The word hung in the air like a threat, and Dolores felt her world tilt on its axis. Alternatives. She knew what that meant. Nursing homes, assisted living facilities, places where old people went to wait for death, surrounded by strangers who were paid to pretend they cared. But before she could respond, before she could plead or argue or ask for more time, Marcos had disappeared into the shadows of his mansion, leaving her alone with the weight of her uncertain future pressing down on her shoulders like a stone. That night, lying on the narrow cot in the small room off the kitchen that served as her quarters, Dolores stared at the ceiling and tried to remember when everything had gone so wrong. When had her son's love turned to indifference, and then to something that felt dangerously close to hatred? When had she become a burden instead of a blessing, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be cherished? The next morning brought no reprieve. Marcos announced at breakfast, with the casual efficiency of a man discussing the weather, that he'd be hosting a family dinner that evening. It was Dolores's birthday, her 73rd, though he made no mention of that fact. She'd hoped, perhaps foolishly, that he might remember, that there might be a cake or even just acknowledgement of the day that had brought her into the world. Instead, she spent the day preparing for what she sensed would be another test, another opportunity for her to prove her worth in a household where her value was measured in tasks completed and problems avoided. She cooked his favorite mouth, same beef stew she'd made for him as a child when he was sick or sad or in need of comfort. She set the table carefully, hoping that the familiar flavors might trigger some memory of who they'd once been to each other. But when the family gathered around the dining room table that evening, Marcos and Linda, the children, even Carmen the nanny who usually ate separately, Dolores realized this wasn't a celebration. It was an execution. Marcos waited until everyone had been served before he stood, his wineglass in hand like a prop in some dark theater production. His face was set in the expression he wore during business meetings, professional and distant and utterly without warmth. "I've called this family meeting," he began, his voice carrying easily across the silent room, "to address a situation that has gone on long enough." His eyes swept the table, touching briefly on each face, before settling on Dolores with the weight of final judgment. "Mother, this living arrangement has become untenable. I've made arrangements for you to be relocated to a facility better suited to your needs." The words hit Dolores like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white against the dark wood, and felt the room spin around her. "Marcos," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sudden roaring in her ears. "Please, I have nowhere else to go." "That's not my problem," he replied, his tone as cold and impersonal as a business transaction. "I did my part. I took you in when you needed help. But this is my house, my family, and I won't have it disrupted any longer by complications. Linda sat silent, her face carefully neutral, studying her manicured nails as if they held the secrets of the universe. Carmen, the nanny, looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. She needed this job, and challenging the man who paid her salary would be career suicide. But it was the children's faces that broke Dolores's heart. Matty stared at his plate, his young face pale with understanding of what was happening. Olivia looked confused, her eyes darting between her father and her grandmother, sensing the tension but not comprehending its full implications. But Daddy, Olivia said in her clear, innocent voice, Grandma helps me with my homework. Who's going to help me with my homework? Marcos's jaw tightened. You have tutors for that. And Carmen can help with anything else you need. And Carmen can help with anything else you need? It's not the same, Matty said quietly, speaking for the first time since his father's announcement. Grandma tells us stories. She knows all about our day. She cares about us. I care about you, Marcos snapped, his composure cracking slightly. Everything I do is for you and your sister. I work 16 hours a day to provide for this family, to give you opportunities I never had. That's caring. But Dolores could see the truth in her grandson's eyes. Money wasn't the same as presents. Success wasn't the same as love. Marcos had confused providing for his children with actually being there for them, and in his absence, she'd filled the void he'd created. When? Dolores asked, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. Tomorrow morning, Marcos replied without hesitation. I've already spoken with the facility. They're expecting you. Tomorrow. Not next week, not next month, but tomorrow. Less than 12 hours to say goodbye to the children who'd become her whole world. To pack up the few possessions she'd managed to accumulate in her 73 years. To prepare for exile to some sterile institution where she'd be surrounded by strangers and stripped of purpose. May I say goodbye to the children privately? She asked, hating how her voice broke on the words. Marcos considered this for a moment, then nodded curtly. 5 minutes, each. 5 minutes. 5 minutes to somehow explain to two young hearts why the person they trusted most was being sent away. Why love wasn't enough to keep a family together. Why the world was sometimes cruel and unfair and utterly without mercy. That night, after the children had been reluctantly sent to bed, and the house had settled into its usual cold silence, Dolores sat on her narrow cot and tried to pack her life into 2 garbage bags. It didn't take long. She'd never been one to accumulate possessions, and Marcos's charity had never extended to providing her with much beyond basic necessities. She folded her few dresses carefully, trying not to remember the occasions when she'd worn them: church services, school plays, family gatherings from a time when family had meant something different. She wrapped her late husband Roberto's rosary in tissue paper, the wooden beads worn smooth by decades of prayer and worry. She packed the photographs she'd managed to save from her apartment, images of birthday parties and graduations and ordinary moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but now felt precious beyond measure. As she worked, she found herself thinking about the woman she'd been before heartbreak had bent her shoulders and worry had lined her face. She'd been strong once, capable of working multiple jobs while raising 3 children alone after Roberto's death. She'd been proud of her resilience, of her ability to stretch a dollar and make something from nothing, of the way she'd managed to keep her family together through pure force of will and love. When had she become so diminished? When had she started measuring her worth by other people's opinions of her value? When had she forgotten that respect was something that had to be given to be received? But as the first light of dawn crept through her small window, Dolores felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a stirring of the woman she used to be. She was 73 years old, not dead. She had survived poverty and loss and heartbreak before. She would survive this too. The morning brought chaos. Matty refused to go to school, clinging to Dolores's legs and crying with the abandon of a child who didn't yet understand that sometimes love wasn't enough to fix what was broken. Olivia hid in her closet, emerging only to slip her favorite stuffed rabbit into Dolores's bag when she thought no one was looking. "Take Rosie with you," she whispered, pressing the worn pink bunny into her grandmother's hands, "so you won't be lonely." Linda stood in the hallway, tapping her foot impatiently and checking her phone, clearly annoyed by the emotional display disrupting her morning routine. Carmen watched from a distance, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes reflecting the sympathy she couldn't voice. Marcos appeared at exactly 9 o'clock, dressed for another day of conquest in the financial world. He'd arranged for a car service to take Dolores to the nursing home, a gesture that might have seemed considerate if it hadn't been so clearly about avoiding further inconvenience to himself. "The car's here," he announced, not meeting her eyes. Not meeting her eyes. "You should go." Dolores looked around the house one last time, at the marble floors she'd scrubbed until they gleamed, at the kitchen where she'd prepared countless meals with love, if not gratitude, at the windows that looked out onto the yard where she'd watched her grandchildren play. Then she picked up her 2 garbage bags and walked toward the door, her back straight and her head held high. She paused at the threshold and turned back to face her son. For a moment she saw something flicker in his eyes, doubt, perhaps, or regret, but it was gone so quickly, she might have imagined it. "Goodbye, Marcos," she said quietly. "I love you. I always have, and I always will. Nothing you do can change that." He said nothing in response, just stood there in his expensive suit, surrounded by his expensive possessions, looking somehow smaller than she'd ever seen him before. The car pulled away from the mansion as storm clouds gathered overhead, and Dolores pressed her face to the window for one last glimpse of the children who were watching from an upstairs window, their small hands pressed against the glass like captive birds desperate for freedom. She waved until the house disappeared from view, and then she turned forward, toward whatever uncertain future awaited her, carrying nothing but 2 garbage bags and a heart full of love that had nowhere left to go. Little did she know that this wasn't the end of her story, but the beginning of something unprecedented battle that would test every fiber of her being and ultimately reveal strengths she'd forgotten she possessed. The Sunset Manor assisted living facility squatted like a concrete monument to abandonment on the outskirts of Queens, its beige walls and barred windows speaking of resignation rather than care. Dolores stood before its entrance, clutching her 2 garbage bags and fighting the urge to run back into the street and disappear into the anonymity of the city. The air smelled of disinfectant and defeat, and somewhere in the building's depths, she could hear the sound of a television playing too loudly, and the shuffle of feet that had forgotten how to hurry toward anything. The intake process was conducted by a woman named Mrs. Patterson, whose practiced smile never reached her eyes and whose clipboard seemed to contain more authority than compassion. She led Dolores through corridors painted in colors designed to be cheerful, but somehow managing only to be garish, past common rooms filled with elderly residents who looked up at her passage with the curious emptiness of people who had stopped, expecting surprises. "Room 247 will be yours," Mrs. Patterson announced, stopping before a door that looked identical to dozens of others they'd passed. "You'll be sharing with Mrs. Chen. She's been here for 3 years now, so she knows the routine. Meals are at 8, 12, and 6. Activities are optional but encouraged. Any questions?" Dolores had 1,000 questions, but none that this woman could answer. How had her life come to this? How had love failed so completely? How was she supposed to live among strangers when her heart was still back in that mansion with 2 children who needed her? Her roommate turned out to be a tiny woman who spoke limited English, but whose eyes held the kind of understanding that transcended language. Mrs. Chen had been a seamstress before arthritis claimed her fingers, and her side of the room was decorated with photographs of grandchildren who lived too far away to visit regularly. She welcomed Dolores with a gentle nod and a cup of tea that tasted like home. And for the first time since leaving Marcos's house, Dolores felt something approximating kindness. The days blurred together in a haze of institutional routine. Meals appeared at regular intervals, nutritionally adequate, but lacking the love that transforms simple ingredients into comfort. Activities were scheduled and supervised, designed to keep idle hands busy and restless minds occupied. Dolores went through the motions, playing bingo and attending craft sessions, but her heart remained elsewhere, with 2 children who were probably wondering why she'd abandoned them without explanation. It was on her 4th night at Sunset Manor that everything changed. Her ancient flip phone, a device Marcos had grudgingly provided years earlier, buzzed against the metal nightstand with a sound that made her heart leap. The message was from Maddie, and the words on the small screen made her hands tremble. "Grandma, where are you? Please come. Get us. We don't want to live here anymore." but it was the second message that shattered what remained of her composure. "Dad says you're dead. Dead." Marcos had told his children that their grandmother was dead, rather than admit he'd sent her away. In his mind, she supposed it was kinder than the truth that he'd discarded her like something broken that couldn't be repaired. But to Maddie and Olivia, she had simply vanished from their lives without explanation, leaving them to grieve a loss they couldn't understand. With shaking fingers, Dolores typed back the address of Sunset Manor. She had no plan, no idea what she would do if the children actually came. But the thought of them believing she was gone forever was unbearable. An hour later, she heard voices in the hallway, young voices, speaking in urgent whispers, and her heart began to race. When she opened the door to room 247, Maddie and Olivia stood in their pajamas, carrying school backpacks and looking like refugees from their own childhood. Their faces were streaked with tears, their eyes wide with the particular terror that comes from realizing the adults you trust have been lying to you. "Grandma!" Olivia threw herself into Dolores's arms with the force of a small hurricane, her body shaking with sobs that seemed too large for her tiny frame. Maddie hung back for a moment, trying to maintain the dignity of his 10 years. But then he too crumbled, pressing his face against her shoulder and crying with the abandon of a child who had been trying to be brave for far too long. "We couldn't take it anymore," Maddie said between gulps of air. "Dad yells all the time now. And Mom, she just pretends we're not there. And Carmen, she tries, but she's not. She's not you." They told her everything then, their words tumbling over each other in their haste to share the truth they'd been carrying alone. How their father had grown increasingly angry since she'd left, snapping at them for minor infractions that he'd previously ignored. How their mother had retreated further into her social calendar, treating them like accessories to be managed rather than children to be loved. How the house had grown cold and silent, filled with expensive things but empty of the warmth that had made it feel like home. "They talk about you like you were never real," Olivia whispered, her small fingers clutching Dolores's worn sweater. "Like you were just nobody." But to these children, she had been somebody. She had been the person who remembered their favorite bedtime stories, who knew that Maddie liked his sandwiches cut diagonally, and that Olivia was afraid of thunderstorms. She had been the keeper of their small secrets, and the witness to their daily triumphs. She had been love made visible, and now that love had been erased from their lives as if it had never existed. Mrs. Chen said nothing when she returned to find 3 people crowded onto the narrow single bed, but she quietly made extra tea and offered cookies from her private stash. That night, grandmother and grandchildren slept tangled together like survivors of a shipwreck, holding tight to each other against the uncertainty that surrounded them on all sides. But morning brought consequences. Dolores woke to pounding on the door and the sound of official voices demanding entry. Through the small window, she could see police cars in the parking lot, their red and blue lights painting the walls in colors of authority and accusation. Marcos had called them, of course. His children were missing, and the obvious suspect was the disturbed old woman who had already proven herself capable of undermining his authority. When the officers entered room 247, they found Dolores sitting on the edge of her bed with her arms around 2 pajama-clad children who clung to her like anchors in a storm. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," the first officer said, his voice not unkind but implacable. "They ran away because she didn't kidnap us," Olivia screamed, her voice cutting through the morning air like a siren. "We ran to her. She's our grandma. She loves us." But the world, Dolores was learning, didn't always listen to the truth specially, when that truth was spoken by children and old women, people whose voices carried little weight in the scales of justice. Money spoke louder, and Marcos had plenty of that. Influence opened doors that love could not breach, and respectability mattered more than reality. They took her to the police station for questioning, and though they released her hours later with only a warning, the damage was done. Marcos wasn't finished with his campaign to erase her from his children's lives. Within days, she found herself the subject of a social media assault that painted her as a manipulative old woman who had poisoned innocent children against their loving parents. The posts appeared on Facebook and Instagram, carefully crafted to present Marcos as a concerned father protecting his family from an unstable influence. Photos were shared, images of the children looking happy at expensive restaurants and exclusive events, proof of the good life he provided. The comments that followed were brutal in their efficiency. What kind of grandmother turns children against their parents? She's probably after their trust fund. Old people can be so manipulative when they're losing their minds. Those poor children being used as pawns in some crazy woman's game. Even Jason, her younger son who lived just 2 subway stops away, but might as well have been on another planet, joined the digital chorus. His comment, posted for all the world to see, cut deeper than any stranger's words could. She's always been manipulative. Maybe it's time she's put somewhere. Permanent. The word echoed in Dolores's mind as she sat in the common room at Sunset Manor, watching other residents shuffle through their prescribed routines. Was this permanent? Was this gray existence, surrounded by institutional furniture and supervised activities, all that remained of her life? The answer came in the form of legal papers served by a man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd stepped out of the same world that had produced her son. Marcos was seeking a restraining order, claiming she posed a danger to his children's emotional well-being. He wanted her legally prevented from any contact with Maddie and Olivia, wanted her erased from their lives as completely as if she had actually died. The hearing was held in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and newer frustrations, presided over by a judge who looked at Dolores with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too many family disputes and not enough easy answers. Marcos sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, a sharp-featured woman who radiated competence and cold efficiency. His wife Linda was there too, playing the role of supportive spouse with an Oscar-worthy performance. Dolores had no lawyer, no advocates except for an overworked public defender who'd had 15 minutes to review her case, and seemed more interested in getting through his docket than achieving justice. She watched as Marcos's attorney painted her as an unstable influence who had manipulated impressionable children, who had disrupted a loving family dynamic, who posed a continuing threat to the welfare of minors. They had evidence, carefully curated and professionally presented. Photos showing the children's distress after visiting her at the nursing home. Testimony from Linda about the emotional disruption Dolores's presence had caused in their household. Expert witnesses who spoke about the psychological damage that could result from exposing children to conflict between adults. When Dolores tried to speak in her own defense, her voice sounded thin and uncertain in the vast courtroom. She told them about the meals she'd cooked, the homework she'd helped with, the bedtime stories that had chased away nightmares. But her words felt inadequate against the weight of professional testimony and expensive legal representation. The judge postponed his decision, ordering the children into temporary state custody while he considered the evidence. Dolores watched in horror as Maddie and Olivia were led away by social workers, their faces pale with confusion and fear. They reached for her as they passed, their small hands stretching across a distance that might as well have been an ocean. "Grandma!" Olivia cried, her voice breaking on the word. "Don't let them take us." But Dolores was powerless to stop it. She had no legal standing, no rights that superseded those of biological parents, no voice that could compete with money and influence and the machinery of institutional authority. She could only watch as the children who loved her disappeared into a system designed to protect them from her. The days that followed were the darkest of her life. She stood outside the state facility where Maddie and Olivia were being held, holding Olivia's stuffed rabbit and hoping they might glimpse her through a window and know they hadn't been forgotten. Security guards eventually asked her to leave, and she found herself walking the streets of Queens with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Have you ever felt completely powerless in the face of a system that seemed designed to work against you? Share your story in the comments. The final blow came in the form of another legal document, this one bearing the seal of the family court and the weight of official judgment. Her parental rights as a grandmother, rights she hadn't even known existed until they were taken away, were officially revoked. She was legally prohibited from any contact with her grandchildren, from even attempting to see them or communicate with them. She stood on the courthouse steps after receiving the news, feeling as if the world had tilted off its axis. People streamed past her, lawyers and clients and witnesses, all part of a system that had just declared her love to be legally irrelevant. Cars honked in the street, life continuing its normal rhythm while hers ground to a halt. That night, she found herself standing at the edge of the East River, looking out at water that reflected the city lights like scattered diamonds. The cold wind bit at her face and tugged at her thin coat, and for a moment, just a moment, she considered what it would feel like to step forward, to let the current carry away the pain and disappointment and crushing loneliness that had become her constant companions. But as she stood there, balanced between despair and release, she felt something in her coat pocket. Her fingers closed around a piece of paper, and when she pulled it out, she saw Olivia's drawing, a picture of the two of them holding hands under a rainbow, with words written in careful 8-year-old script. "Grandma, you're my safe place." Safe place. She stared at the drawing until her tears made the crayon colors blur, and suddenly she understood something that had been hidden from her in the darkness of her grief. She wasn't just fighting for her own right to love and be loved. She was fighting for 2 children who needed to know that safe places existed in a world that had shown them precious little safety. She stepped back from the water's edge. The next morning, Dolores walked into the offices of News Channel 7 and asked to speak to someone about telling her story. The receptionist looked skeptical. After all, she was just another old woman with a complaint about unfair treatment, but something in her bearing, some remnant of the strength that had carried her through decades of hardship, must have been compelling. The reporter who agreed to see her was a young woman named Sarah Martinez, whose own grandmother had raised her after her parents' divorce. Sarah listened as Dolores laid out the whole sordid tale, producing evidence in the form of school reports praising her involvement in the children's education, letters from teachers who had seen her dedication firsthand, photos of birthday parties, and school plays where she had been present while the parents were notably absent. "This isn't just about one family," Sarah said when Dolores finished her story. "This is about how we treat our elders, about the rights of grandparents, about what happens when wealth tries to silence love. But sometimes truth has its own momentum." And within hours, Dolores's phone was ringing with calls from other grandparents who had faced similar battles, from advocacy groups who wanted to help, from lawyers who specialized in family rights cases. Social media, which had been used as a weapon against her, became a tool for justice. The hashtag Grandma's Rights began trending, accompanied by photos of elderly women with their grandchildren and stories of families torn apart by legal technicalities and financial disparities. Women across the country, especially grandmothers, began sharing their own experiences of being marginalized by adult children who had forgotten the love that had shaped their early years. A retired family court judge named Patricia Williams saw the news report and was moved to offer her services pro bono. She had spent 30 years on the bench, she told Dolores, and had seen too many cases where money had trumped justice, where children had been treated as property rather than people with their own needs and desires. "We're going to fight this," Judge Williams said at their first meeting, her steel gray hair and no-nonsense demeanor projecting the kind of authority that came from decades of making difficult decisions. "Not just for you, but for every grandmother who's been told her love doesn't matter." The case that resulted was unlike anything the family court had seen before. What had begun as a simple custody dispute became a referendum on family values, on the rights of extended family members, on the question of whether love could be legally quantified and distributed. Media attention intensified as advocacy groups rallied around Dolores's cause, and the courthouse steps became a gathering place for supporters, carrying signs that read, "Love knows no price tag," and "Grandmothers are family too." When the hearing reconvened, the courtroom was packed with observers. Dolores sat at the defendant's table, flanked by Judge Williams and a team of volunteer attorneys who had joined her cause. Across the aisle, Marcos looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of public scrutiny and the realization that his private family matter had become a very public trial. But it was the surprise witness that changed everything. Carmen Restrepo, the nanny who had worked for the family for 3 years, had been following the case in the news. Her conscience, she later said, wouldn't let her remain silent while injustice was being done. She had made recordings secretly, illegally, but devastatingly, effectively of conversations in the household that revealed the truth behind Marcos's carefully constructed narrative. The judge listened in silence as Carmen's recordings played in the courtroom. Marcos's voice filled the space, cruel and dismissive. "I wish I'd never let that old woman back into our lives. She's nothing but a burden, a reminder of where we came from." Linda's voice chimed in with equal venom. "The children are too attached to her. It's unhealthy. She makes them think we're not enough." But it was the children's voices that provided the most damning testimony. Olivia, crying after another of her father's outbursts. "I want Grandma. She never yells at us. Maddie, trying to comfort his sister. Maybe if we're really good, Daddy will let her come back. The courtroom fell silent when the recordings ended. Marcos sat pale and still, his expensive suit unable to armor him against the truth of his own words. Linda stared at her hands, the careful facade of supportive motherhood crumbling in the face of recorded evidence. When the judge called Maddie and Olivia to testify, they entered the courtroom hand in hand, looking impossibly small in the adult world of legal procedures and formal protocols. But their voices, when asked where they wanted to live, were clear and unwavering. With Grandma, they said in unison, their eyes finding Dolores across the crowded room and lighting up with pure, uncomplicated love. The judge's decision was swift and unequivocal. Not only was the restraining order lifted, but temporary custody was awarded to Dolores, pending a full investigation into the children's home environment. The courtroom erupted in applause, and Dolores found herself surrounded by strangers who had become allies, all of them celebrating a victory that belonged to more than just one family. But even in triumph, she felt compassion for her son. When the crowd had thinned, and the media had moved on to other stories, she approached Marcos as he sat alone at the plaintiff's table, looking lost and defeated. "I never wanted to take them away from you," she said quietly. "I just wanted to love them. There's room in their hearts for all of us." He looked up at her then, and for just a moment, she saw the little boy he had once been. The child who had crawled into her lap when he was frightened and whispered his secrets into her ear. But the moment passed, and he turned away, unable to bridge the chasm that his choices had created between them. The apartment that Dolores found for herself and the children was small and modest, donated by a local church that had been moved by her story. It had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen barely large enough for a table, and windows that looked out onto a busy street rather than manicured gardens. But it had something that Marcos's mansion had lacked: the warmth that comes from being truly wanted, truly loved, truly home. That first night, as she tucked Maddie and Olivia into the bed they would share until she could afford separate rooms, Olivia asked the question that had been weighing on all their hearts. "Are we safe now, Grandma? Are we really home?" Dolores smoothed the little girl's golden curls and smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't known in months settling into her bones like a blessing. "Yes, Mia," she whispered. "We're home." And as she turned off the light and listened to the children's breathing settle into the rhythm of sleep, she understood that she had won more than a custody battle. She had reclaimed her voice, her dignity, her right to love and be loved in return. She had proven that sometimes David really could defeat Goliath, that love really could triumph over money, that the bonds of the heart were stronger than any legal document or social prejudice. The woman who had been discarded like garbage, who had been told she made the house rot, who had been declared legally irrelevant, was now the legal guardian of 2 precious souls who called her their safe place. And in that small apartment filled with laughter and love and the promise of tomorrow, Dolores Pearson, grandmother, fighter, survivor, finally understood her true worth. She was not the richest woman in the world, but she was the most beloved. And that, she realized, was the only currency that truly mattered. Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.